The death of George Floyd has reignited conversations about race and inequality in this country. It has also galvanized efforts to have the many symbols of hate in our nation removed. One man in Virginia is using his museum to weigh in on the conversation from a historical perspective. Skylar Henry reports from Pocahontas Island.
This is something that you want to keep in the family.
On these 50-some-odd acres,
walking down this place here remind my ancestors as slaves they brought through here.
77-year-old Richard Stewart says he knows his hometown's history.
Once you rub your arm twice and the color don't come off, that's who you are.
For life.
Yeah, for life.
And while he's looking to preserve it, he thinks it can give some guidance to the current state of the country.
This is my payback to my community that I bought this land to make sure they never be denied a route to the river.
The Appomattox River, where slave ships once sailed. This peninsula that locals call Pocahontas Island, just south of Richmond, Virginia, edges that river and touts itself as the oldest black community in the country. Stewart built up a museum on the land.
So, Emancipation Proclamation is signed.
After emancipation, a lot of slaves flooded this place. They thought by virtue of being here, everything will be all right.
It's a place Stewart says is steeped in just as much history.
And I always highlight these here.
Shackles.
These are shackles.
It's heavy.
Yes, they are.
Goodness.
Throughout the house he retrofitted are artifacts showcasing Pocahontas' past that had been all but forgotten until a tornado ripped through the town, bringing the spotlight back.
And God saved this place because this was the ghetto and crime. And then after that, Del Waller, America's first black governor, he appropriated money from the government grants, and that helped us come back. But at Bowling I worked as a pen boy. Black and whites is not bowl together. This is me right there.
The former civil rights activist says the museum's exhibits are displayed with proper context.
It was given to me by some white friends of mine to remind me of the past. They only wanted it for the museum.
Perhaps specialized museums are fitting as the country revisits the debate over removing controversial statues.
But America's changing. Either you're going to change with it, or you better step aside because it's going to move forward.
Moving forward, Stewart says, with a roadmap that starts on Pocahontas soil, rich with lessons of the past and potential for the future.
And for more, Skylar Henry joins me now. Welcome, Skylar. Great package there. So we're seeing symbols of the country's painful past with race being removed all over the country. And yet this museum, as you showed us, includes the Confederate flag and the Ku Klux Klan robe. You know, do you think that symbols of hate within the context of history, within the context of a museum, are probably the only appropriate context for these symbols?
Well, it's funny. You said that word 3 times, Tanya, context. And I think that's something that 77-year-old Richard Stewart had in mind when he had these different artifacts in his museum that he made. He actually funded this. He owns several properties on this Pocahontas Island, and he retrofitted one of his houses to this museum. And he thought that it would be incredibly important to have these artifacts in this museum, again, with proper context. Now, when you look at the things happening across the country when it comes to statues, monuments, even military bases and things like that, particularly when it comes to naming them for Confederate heroes, so to speak, I think a lot of people fear as though these things have been paraded around the country for decades now without that context. I mean, when you look at some of the statues that have been toppled, particularly here in Washington, D.C., you hear people who say things like, these things aren't necessarily portraying the history of the country on the perspective of those who are necessarily oppressed. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of African American people who were enslaved here. And so they feel as though these statues represent a time in our history where Black people were oppressed, where people who were trying to be free didn't have an opportunity to do so, in large part because of these figures that are idolized, so to speak, with these statues that are happening, that are across the country and, ironically, in the Capitol as well.
So tell us a little bit more about Pocahontas Island. It's a fascinating place. It touts itself as the oldest Black community in the country. Is that correct? Can you explain a little bit more about the island's role in the Underground Railroad and in American history?
Right. So Pocahontas Island, if you drive past it too fast, you would definitely miss it. So it's about 30 minutes south of Richmond, Virginia, a stone's throw from Petersburg, and in there's a community of about 70 or so people or so. But Richard Stewart, his family has been a part of this community for centuries there. As you heard in the piece, slave or those who were enslaved went to Pocahontas Island right after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, that they were actually notified of it. Obviously, people realized that just because the Emancipation Proclamation was signed doesn't mean that slaves automatically knew that that they were free. And so you can imagine the ripple effect there in terms of communication. But according to Stewart, he says that a lot of the people who were enslaved went to Pocahontas Island to get an opportunity to, one, have a house, to have a family, and really do all of these things. There's another really interesting thing that he says in the piece, having that access to the river and having access to the water. Well, for decades after the Emancipation Proclamation, there were still families who lived along that river who prevented slaves from actually accessing certain parts of the land. And so Richard Stewart actually put up a lot of that land to make sure that his family and people who look like him had access to not only the river, but the land around it.
All right. Once again, great piece, Skylar Henry. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tanya.